This is an Alternerd reality podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Alternerd Reality Network. My name is Chris, aka Chewburger84. Now, the interview that you're going to be hearing today was with Dr. David Zendle. Now, he is a researcher and a lecturer from the York University in the UK, and the main topic of research for him is looking into video games and the possible psychological side effects of playing them. Now, his early research, which we talk about at the start of the podcast, looked into are there actually psychological violence priming from these games that carry over into the real world. We bust some of the myths that are associated with psychological links to video gaming. But the main topic that we talk about is on the phenomenon of loot boxes. Now, they're in almost every video game out there today, and David was the first researcher to go out and actually look at, is there potential links or actual harm between loot boxes and perhaps not only children, but also adults. It's a fantastic listen. We definitely recommend that you listen right through to the end. Now, if you're looking for more sensational alternate reality content, unfortunately, the website will now no longer be launching until the end of April, but we'll do some announcements when we get closer. For now, for most of your updated news and content, head on over to the Alternate Reality YouTube channel. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I'm sure we'll be back soon with some more. First of all, David, do you go by Dr. David Zendle or just by David?
Oh, I'm happy just to go by David.
Just by David?
You work at a university, everyone's got a doctorate. So,
That's true. That's true. But so for those people that are tuning in for the first time, I am joined by David Zendle, who has not only a bachelor's degree and a Master of Arts, but is also a PhD in computer sciences and has a very interesting dissertation that he did back then, which we're going to talk about in a little while. But David, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about the research.
Absolutely. So, I mean, let's start off looking at a lot of what you've done so far, not just at university, but with your career and the research that you've done. A lot of it seems to be very video game centric. Is that something I noticed you on your website, you call yourself a gamer. Are you sort of driven by that first and foremost?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got into doing video games research because I played games. I've been playing and making games for as long as I remember. It's really a passion of mine. And so when I started reading research about violence in video games and how violent video games might make people violent, it kind of didn't tally with my own experiences. And that became something I wanted to look into. And that's what got me doing video game research. The idea that there was a bunch of papers out there talking about something that I really knew quite a lot about and cared quite a lot about, and they seemed to be talking about it from a perspective that didn't really understand what was going on in the games. So they were sort of saying, you're playing a violent video game, you're thinking about violence the whole time, you're seeing guns, you're seeing killing, you're seeing violence, and it's like that stuff is happening in your home. Those ideas become rehearsed and you go out and then you're more likely to do those things yourself. And I sort of thought, wait a minute, that doesn't fit my experiences. And that's what got me going.
Yeah, I actually saw that some of that research that you did was actually discussed in the US Senate. When they're talking about, gun violence and video game associations. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this really influential theory of like what video games do to people called the GAM, or the General Aggression Model. And what the GAM basically says is that you play a game which contains depictions of violence. You're enacting violence, you're seeing violence, violence is happening. And so the violent thoughts that you have, what they call aggressive cognitions, become primed. So they're more likely to be used temporarily. So you play violence, someone comes up to you and taps you on the shoulder or something, you're more likely to interpret that as being violent, you're more likely to respond in a violent way. And this theory says that that stuff becomes like ingrained. The word is rehearsed that they use in the literature over time. So you play once and you're temporarily more likely to be more violent. You play twice, you play 10 times, you play 1,000 times. Now you're permanently more likely to be violent because your violent thoughts are permanently primed. And they use that, certain scholars use that to say that violent video games are responsible for acts of real world violence and murder, like school shootings. And so I thought, okay, let's test that. Let's see if this happens. So I ran a bunch of experiments that basically suggest that that process doesn't happen. That when you see violence in a game, it doesn't automatically become primed and therefore more likely to drive your behaviour, which suggests that this pathway from playing a violent video game to taking part in a school shooting doesn't necessarily work. And that's what got brought up in the Senate hearings, because back after a big shooting about a year ago, Trump sort of basically identified video games as a causal factor. He said there are lots of people that are saying bad things about video games to me, and you know, we're going to call the video games industry to the White House and sort of talk to them about it. He sort of called them all in and said, you know, look what you're making, this is very violent. And he set up this inquiry into the causes of school shootings. And as part of that, they had experts coming in, and my research was one of the things that was used in expert testimony to sort of Jeff Sessions or whoever was there, by another very good academic, someone I really admire, called Chris Ferguson, where he basically said, look, there's this result out there which sort of says that the links that people say should be going on if violent video games really do cause school shootings just aren't there.
Yeah, right. So so the two of you, most of the evidence that was presented in that hearing was for, I guess, as gamers, and our experiences with gaming probably made sense, is that there doesn't seem to be a link at this stage in regard to that priming behavior.
Right, and it's really interesting why that's the case. So if we rewind to the mid-90s, it seems like there is a link, right? So if we're having this conversation, 20 years ago, mid-90s, it's all but certain that violence in video games primes violent thoughts, leads to violent behavior. There is huge amounts of research on the table that says that. There is nothing that contradicts it. What has happened in the last 10 years or so is lots of people have gone back to that foundational research that really has been driving this debate for decades and said, hold on a minute, there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with the way they conducted those studies. It's really interesting. So the whole violence in video games thing is built around these experiments where you give one group of people one game, give another group of people another game, and then afterwards you measure their violent thoughts, their violent behaviors, all sorts of stuff like that. But the key thing, and the thing that we as gamers will understand, is that there are differences with these games that are being used in these experiments. So they're like, oh, we're going to test the presence of violence on your violent thoughts after playing a game. So they give one group of people this game called Marathon, which is like a super complex, really difficult to control first-person shooter. Give a bunch of people that, measure their violence, measure their violent thoughts, measure their aggression. They give another group of people sort of a really simple glider throwing game. It's like 2D side-on, it's not so complicated, and they measure how violent and aggressive they are after that. And and they're like, oh, look, the people who played the first-person shooter game were more aggressive afterwards, therefore violent content in games causes aggression. But as gamers will know that those games vary in a bunch of different ways, right? It's not just the presence or absence of violence. Have you ever tried to control have you seen anyone try and play a first-person shooter who doesn't play first-person shooters? They just can't do it. It's unbelievably frustrating. And the kind of stuff that really great academics like Chris Ferguson and Andrew Shabilsky do is they go back and they run these studies, but they also measure frustration as well. And guess what? There's difference in frustration.
And I mean, even as a gamer, I mean, I find that if I'm playing something single player and relaxing, I'm just cruising through the world of, an RPG or something like that, I'm definitely much more aggressive and frustrated if I'm in a competitive environment, let alone what the game is. It could be Mario Kart. If my little sister beats me, I'm throwing something at the wall, right?
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
It's not this, and that means that it doesn't fit the model, right? So the model is like this cognitive model where you're learning what behaviors are appropriate and what behaviors are rewarded by viewing violence. You see violence. Oh, violence is rewarded. Go into my regular everyday life and behave like that. But what we're talking about is a really different mechanism, which is much more like playing sports or something like that. And it doesn't fit. But of course, you only know that if you play the games yourself. If you can see why people are worried about this stuff. Because say you're a parent, you don't play games, you're watching your child, and they're ripping someone's head off with a chainsaw. You're like, oh my God, is my child now going to go rip people's heads off with a chainsaw? But of course, you're not thinking about chainsaws. I talked about this guy who he claimed to play Metal Gear Solid semi-professionally. I didn't even know that was a thing. But sure, maybe there's a big competitive multiplayer Metal Gear Solid scene out there.
Maybe.
And I think he claimed to play another couple of games professionally as well. I can't remember, this was a while ago, and I never recorded it, which I should have done. And he said, when maybe played Call of Duty as well, I can't really remember. But anyway, the thing that he said that stuck with me was, I was right at the beginning of my research, and I was like, so you're playing these games, you're making thousands of kills every day. That must be really upsetting because you're sort of thinking about killing thousands of times a day. He said, when I play these games, I don't see people, I just see boxes. I think that's how a lot of us play competitively. Like, right? We're not thinking about the avatar in the game is a real human being with like a family and a life and stuff like that. We're just trying to optimize our scores. We're just trying to max out our stats. It's not to do with violence.
No, not at all. And it's actually interesting because I've sort of read a lot of the research as we've been talking over the last couple of weeks. And it was interesting to see the way that your research evolved as the conversation evolved, as some of the answers that these people trying to put in rules and laws against video games realized they didn't have evidence. It became, well, the games are getting more realistic now. So if it's more realistic, if it's more of a life simulation, it's going to have more of an impact. But what you researched didn't necessarily line up with that theory.
Yeah, it was. So I started out with just like, is the presence of something in a game going to prime people? And I found the stuff about that where like it doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to really happen. And then I started to get interested in realism because realism is really interesting because people constantly talk about realism in games and say, oh, the realistic games are going to be the really bad ones. As if it's self-evident, but like actually the research base on realism is really thin. There's really very little out there on like realism in games, which is a huge problem because we're kind of making these statements that like, oh, realism bad, without really knowing what we're talking about, just because it seems obvious. Just like earlier, I was like, oh yeah, if your kids cutting people's heads off with a chainsaw, it seems commonsensical that is bad for them. Similarly, it seems commonsensical that realism is bad for people. So there's a bunch of research on realism where one thing I like to do is like build little games. So I built like a game where you're driving a car around and you have to hit pedestrians, sort of a bit like Grand Theft Auto. And I skinned it up so it was like really realistic or not so realistic. So in one condition, like you got proper sort of models of people walking around with animations and textures and things. And the other one, they're just sort of like these Minecrafty blocks. And I got some people to play the realistic looking game and I got some people to play the not realistic looking game. And I measured their aggressive cognitions afterwards. And like, there's no difference. Nothing's going on there. If anything, it was the other way around where people in the unrealistic game felt slightly more aggressive than people in the realistic game. But really, it was like much of a muchness. Like, which is really surprising because like everyone talks as if realism is like all sewn up and we know realism's bad. But actually, we don't at all. And whilst we focus on these things, we focus really heavily on violence, on realism. Now people are talking about VR. While we focus on these things, like real sources of harm could slip into our games, which is what I think may well have happened with loot boxes. Like we've been looking so hard at violence and concentrating so hard on this idea of like a game as a representation of like a virtual world and like bad stuff going on in the game leads to bad stuff in your head, that we've missed like essentially the introduction of a slot machine right in the middle of most of our games. Which is what I looked at after that.
And thank you for the greatest segue we possibly could have had there, which is leading into obviously the main reason that we're here today and why I reached out to you in the first place. So for those of you who aren't aware, David published the very first one in the world empirical study on the side effects of loot boxes on gamers. So if there are people that are naive and let's say they're a parent and their kids are playing these games, what is a loot box if you had to describe it?
Okay, so the way I talk about loot boxes is I say that in-game items that can be bought for real-world money, but you don't know what you're getting when you pay your cash. So say I'm buying a loot box in Counter-Strike. I pay real-world money for, technically I'm paying real-world money for a key actually in Counter-Strike to open a box. But when I pay that money, I don't know what's going to be in the box that I'm opening. It might be something unbelievably rare and really valuable and really high prestige. It might be a really cool and attractive skin that maybe is worth thousands of dollars on a resale market. That might be what I'm paying my cash for. Or it might be something rubbish that is frankly ugly, valueless, worth only cents. So you're paying real world money, but you don't know what you're getting. And because you're paying, because essentially what you're doing when you're buying a loot box is you're staking cash you have in hand now on a favourable outcome from a chance future event. People have started to say, hold on a minute, staking money you've got now on the future outcome of some chance event, that just sounds exactly like gambling. And there's lots of concern that it's either like legally a form of gambling, and like there's literally loads of illegal gambling going on in games, or that it's in some way going to provide a gateway to gambling. Because at the moment, loot boxes are like, this way of paying for stuff is totally unregulated in most markets across the world. So like you got loads of kids buying them, and basically there's loads of worries that that might be leading to real harm in society.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, even you're in the UK at the moment, so even they were publishing the latest statistics last year on youth. So under those kids between sort of 14 to 16 or 11 to 14, they have those different age brackets. And even the data that was coming through over there at the moment was suggesting that there has been steady rises in gambling style behaviors in kids in that age bracket. Do you think, I mean, at the moment, the questions are only starting to come in at the moment that could loot boxes be involved, but with what you've seen, do you think it's playing a part?
Right, so I think that's a really good question. So what have I seen? What I've done in my research is I've basically gone out there and I've asked groups of gamers. Many gamers have volunteered loads of their time to take part in these studies. I've asked them how much money they're spending on loot boxes, and then I've used a standard measure of problem gambling. I've basically say, how much are you spending? How bad's your problem gambling? And problem gambling is like an excessive and disordered engagement with gambling activities that causes like really severe harm to the person who's engaging with it. It's linked to depression and anxiety and drug abuse and bankruptcy and all kinds of bad things. So we measure people spending on loot boxes, and we measure their problem gambling as well. And what we found consistently, basically, no matter who we talk to, there's a link. The more you spend on loot boxes, the worse your problem gambling is. What we haven't figured out yet is why that's the case. Now, like, it might be that that link is there. The more you spend on loot boxes, the worse your problem gambling is, because like spending on the loot box is literally causing problem gambling. So you spend money on loot boxes. They're very gambling-like. They're very slot machine-like. You get used to expecting the excitement of that randomized reward you get from the loot box. And then you go out into the real world and you see a slot machine and you're like, this is just exactly the same. So you start engaging in gambling behavior. Hence, loot boxes cause problem gambling. But it might be the opposite way as well. Like, so problem gamblers are people who have disordered excessive engagement in gambling activities that's often not within their voluntary control. So when they playing one of their favorite video games and suddenly something comes up that is psychologically so similar to a slot machine, because of their pre-existing gambling problems, they spend excessively on that. They spend loads of money on that. But in either case, it's kind of suggestive that harm may be going on, suggesting that something is going wrong here. Like, if loot boxes literally cause problem gambling, that's terrible. Okay, we can all agree that's awful. But on the other hand, if problem gamblers spend loads of money on loot boxes, then this mechanism is kind of a way for games companies to reap massive profits from the most vulnerable of their customers. Like, loot boxes estimated to have generated $30 billion last year. Like, it's a lot of cash.
Oh, mate. And the scary thing about that is as well, is that they're predicting that by 2022, that 30 billion is going to evolve into 50 billion US dollars.
It's
like
crazy.
That is, and that's the part that I guess concerns me the most, that obviously you're exactly right. A lot of people are buying into this. Are they doing it because of addictive behaviors, or addictive behaviors created by that? As you say, we don't know whether it's cause and effect yet. But that makes it much harder, I guess, to try and get them to move away from this. So, I mean, let's move it up to a government type perspective, because the research you're talking about right now, your research is being presented in the Netherlands. Your research is being presented back home for me in Australia at the moment, basically saying, look, do we need to step in and regulate this? So with what you've seen, your research being talked about in those settings, do you think we're going to get more governmental regulation on these things?
I think something has to happen. So there are a couple of different things that can happen, right? So there is the massive Netherlands, Belgium style sledgehammer where they say, this is illegal gambling and it's getting shut down. And that's what happened in the Netherlands and Belgium. It tripped certain technical requirements within their frameworks for defining what is and isn't gambling. And they basically said, this is done. You're done. You're not selling these anymore. So that's the nuclear option. That's right at one end. But there are a broad spread of things that can happen to loot boxes. It looks like there's potential for harm there, and we know lots of different ways to minimize harm. Like the most obvious one is like a content descriptor, right? Content descriptor isn't much. So say I'm buying Rocket League for my kids. Rocket League is rated 3+. Like, it's not too much to ask to put a sticky label on that says, look, by the way, this has got loot boxes in it.
Yeah.
And then you've got slightly more sophisticated options, like you could put age ratings. You could say, okay, actually, this isn't going to be classed as gambling, but we think it's potentially linked to harm in the way that other things in games might potentially be linked to harm. So we're going to just put an age rating on it. We're going to say, look, you can't play loot box games unless you're 18 or over, or something like that. So there's a broad spread of things that will happen, that could happen. And whilst it'll be up to each different like nation or state to work out what it's going to do, I would be surprised if some of those things didn't start happening.
The Netherlands one was a really interesting case because, as you said, there was very specific technical requirements. So tell me if I've got this wrong, because I've been reading a lot of this over the last couple of weeks. The Netherlands was interesting in the sense they didn't ban all loot boxes. They only banned loot boxes that produced items that then you could re-on sell for real money. So then it was considered actual, what do you call it? Like basically it was tangible. It was something you could sell on. It was a product. And things like Dota 2's keys, or the keys that you mentioned before, for example. It's only that style. Was there any discussion why they didn't consider all loot boxes and only those?
Yeah, the Netherlands situation is really, really interesting because actually I'm in contact with people from the Netherlands and they're saying, hey, we're using your research to determine what we're going to do with loot boxes. But actually what they did then was no decision at all to do with harm. It was to do with laws that already existed. So they already had stuff in place. And like every country, the way gambling is defined in every country is slightly different, just because we all speak different languages and we write stuff down slightly differently. And the way they've got it written down in the Netherlands meant that as soon as you could get the cash value out through those secondary markets, it became gambling and it had to be shut down. It wasn't to do with harm at all. It wasn't to do with what they were doing to people. It was to do with pre-existing laws and boxes that got ticked. Which is really interesting because it brings you to the idea of value. So like most countries don't have any regulation to cover loot boxes because of value. So the idea with loot boxes is that they are not gambling because you don't get something of cash value out the other end. You just get an in-game item. And that prevents it from being technically classed as gambling, regardless of whether it's linked to harm or not. So in many ways, the Netherlands made no decision at all about the harmfulness of loot boxes. They just made a decision about the pre-existing laws and whether they were being tripped.
Yeah, and look, I'm glad you brought that up as well in the concept of basically why many countries have not enacted these as technical gambling. And one is obviously if you can't trade it to someone else, it's not a real thing, therefore it has no value, so you can't gamble for it. And then number two is what you just mentioned, that obviously they walk away with something. So I was talking to you very briefly on this. I'd love to, I guess, give you an example of the thing that makes me really uncomfortable is how gaming companies now are evolving that game. They're pushing the boundaries to see how much they can get away with. So let me give you one example. So Fox Next, which is a subsidiary of Disney, they make a game called Marvel Strike Force, which is actually a game that me and a few friends, we do some content for that game. Now, they introduced basically a system of progression, which is called Red Star Orbs, if you will, which, of course, you can either play the game and unlock them or you can just buy them, okay?
Sure.
Now, this is where it gets complex because what they do now is eventually you're going to unlock most of what you're going to unlock, and then you keep getting the same thing over and over. So they put in a system that basically said, okay, if you don't get anything from the roll, it's okay. We're going to give you these magic shards. And when you have 5,000 magic shards, you can unlock a, super mega box or an elite orb, if you will. Now, there's a 75% chance on that orb that you're going to roll something that you may already have. And it actually gives you only 900 of those magic tokens back. So you put in 5,000, but you only get 900 back. So we did some maths on it and worked out if you were to buy enough of the normal ones leading to the magic beans that give you the 5,000 shards, if you will, it's basically like paying $60 and being given $10.75 in change. And when we saw this implemented, we were like, this has to be over the line. Yeah. So when you hear systems like that, it seems like there's a loophole they've just gotten by. But do you think it's mechanisms like this that they're really pushing the boundaries?
Yeah, it sounds like it, actually. So one thing that you mentioned there that particularly is interesting is the fact that you put stuff in, so you put these shards in, and you get some shards back, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Correct.
But you don't get all the shards back. You have theoretically won something, but you've actually lost. This is the go-to move of the multi-line slot machine industry. So the idea with the so slot machines used to be spiky, right? So you put some cash in, you'd either get nothing or you get something. You put some cash in, nothing, something, cash in, nothing, something, and that is a spiky ride where you're constantly feeling like you're losing out, and it's not as addictive as other things. Much more addictive, it seems, is a smooth ride where you put some money in and you get a little bit back, or you get almost all your money back. And you think, oh, actually, I've won. I'll reinvest that in some more. And that's what's led to people calling multi-line slots like the crack cocaine of gambling. Because this idea that you win and you win and you win and you win and you win until you have no money left. And at no point have you really felt like you've lost. And it's interesting because now we are seeing these mechanisms appear in loot boxes. Like the most bold is the near miss. I mean, like, if you're opening a CSGO or a Dota loot box, you get, you see stuff going around and you think, oh, I really want that, but you don't quite get it. So you try again. And that's a slot machine technique. That's a roulette wheel technique. So we are, I think the interesting thing about loot boxes is how much they parallel gambling. I think it's very interesting that if video games companies are, as they're claiming, just trying to provide fun experiences to their gamers and give everyone a good time, it's curious that they look so much like a casino.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the design of those loot boxes. I mean, I've been to a casino and played a slot machine. I've played a lot of video games that have slot machines. And the big, exciting explosions, there's very dull colors when you're not doing well. There's bright purples and yellows and gold, really trying to go after those dopamine hits and make you feel really, really good when you get it and really, really down when you don't. I mean, psychologically speaking, I'm sure you guys must be getting data from some of your colleagues, or at least anecdotal, that there's a lot of similarities between those two designed to hook people.
Right. So there's a really, so these two people from where you're from, actually, one from New Zealand, one from Australia, called Drummond and Sauer. I'm not sure if I ever pronounced Sauer's name right, Sauer. And they wrote a super neat paper where they basically said, look, there are these specific psychological criteria that are well known in the gambling literature that differentiate gambling from other behaviors. And if something has these qualities, then it is psychologically the same as gambling. Don't care about your laws, don't care about your technicalities. We're talking about the mind, what is analogous psychologically to gambling rather than like what's in your specific law book. And they basically went through a bunch of loot boxes in different games, and they said, oh, actually, these specific loot boxes in these specific games tick all the criteria to be psychologically considered the same as gambling. And maybe you should think about regulating them. So yeah, we've got a theory of why loot boxes might be linked to gambling. We've got some data that says they're linked to gambling too now. And like this data, every time you run the study, you get the same response, which is really good evidence that this is a real thing in the world. Every time we measure problem gambling and we measure loot box spending, regardless of whether we're doing it on micro workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk from the USA, regardless of whether we're doing it on adolescents from the UK, regardless of whether we're doing it on a broad sample of 7,000 gamers, we get this link. It exists. We just don't know if it's because loot boxes cause problem gambling or if problem gambling makes you spend more money on loot boxes. Like, so there's something there.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think anyone that's around loot boxes kind of knows this as a gamer. But I mean, I guess let me put on my conspiracy hat here. And this is very, I guess, out there. So, I mean, you know, there's shootings in the US. Logical thing would be ban the guns, but they come after video games because there's nothing really to lose there. You and I mentioned like $30 billion is a lot of taxable money that governments can make. Do you think that the lobbying groups like the ESA in the United States, who represent all the gaming companies that are kind of going to the ESRB, who regulate things like loot boxes, do you think that the financial side of these things is a reason this has been preserved, even when morally and ethically speaking, loot boxes are pretty, you know, terrible?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'd be shocked if finance didn't play a large role in this. It is hugely profitable for the video games industry, and the video games industry has a lot of reasons to continue wanting to continue with it, because it's one of those dominant business models. Like, everyone is doing loot boxes now. I'm not sure if it's a wise tactic though. So at the moment, if you see how industry talks about loot boxes, they basically in no way want to be associated with gambling. So they say, we are not in the gambling business. We are not interested in doing gambling. This is not gambling. No, 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 no. And then they basically, it's a full denial. And you can see why they do that, because they don't want to get hit with the hammer of gambling classification. And you talk about tax, you can tax the heck out of gambling. Like if there's one thing that's really taxable, it's gambling, and you really do not want to be classified as gambling, because not only do you get taxed, you have to obey a bunch of very, very strict rules to do with what you can and can't do and who you can and can't sell to. So they really don't want to be classified as gambling, so they push back that way. But on the other hand, it might lead to a case where they basically give nothing for so long that they do get hit with the sledgehammer of gambling regulation. Whereas if there was some approach towards harm minimization on their behalf, maybe it would be a softer hit. But I think we'd be very naive if we thought this wasn't all to do with money. The money is
absolutely. Yeah, and do you think that this conversation sort of evolved into the forefront around the time we sort of had, you know, speaking of companies not wanting to be associated with gambling, using Disney as an example again, was the Star Wars game last year from EA, which is obviously, I think that's when many. So one of the really interesting things about loot boxes, I was about to say, I think that's when everyone became aware of loot boxes. Nobody knows about loot boxes outside. That's I think when all gamers were all aware of loot boxes at that point. Oh yeah.
But outside of gaming, nobody knows. It's really surprising. Like, we think of loot boxes as something that, of course, we could sit down with each other and have a long conversation about all the different kinds of loot boxes. People don't know. They don't know they're there. And I think that's the surprising thing. Like, so say you are going out and you're buying a game for your kid or something. Like, you almost certainly, unless you play games yourself, do not know what a loot box is or how it might affect them. Yeah. So yeah, I think this kicked off around the time of that Star Wars thing amongst gamers, and I think that the next 6 months, this is my prediction, the next 6 months is when it's going to become known amongst everyone. Like, whether or not you play games, I think in 6 months' time, everyone is going to know about loot boxes. I just have a feeling that this is the time that the awareness becomes really, really strong. And that's because we are seeing, we had a statement by 16 regulators where they all signed a statement saying, like, look, we're worried about the harm into loot boxes. We had the Australian Senate inquiry, which was really visible. Now we've got in the UK we've got something called a select committee inquiry by a sort of group of MPs that's looking into loot boxes right now. That's very public. There's lots of TV and radio programs I keep on hearing about that might be made about this within the next 6 months.
Okay.
In the US, there's an FTC investigation into loot boxes. It feels like now is the time when it becomes universally known. And that's a very interesting time, because when everyone knows about loot boxes, what the heck are they going to do? Like,
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because that FTC announcement came out where it was kind of like, it was kind of a warning shot where if you read the subtext of it, it kind of read, we know you're there. We're pretty sure you're doing something wrong, but we don't know exactly how to prove it yet. Here's your choice. Regulate yourselves so we don't have to. Because if we come in, we're going to have to do a lot of things that you don't want us to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
And not long after that, EA has now made this claim that none of the games they produce, so the same company that kickstarted this really large conversation, they're getting out of loot boxes for the next 12 months, which is fascinating.
I know, it's incredible.
Oh, really?
Did you see Fortnite? Did you see Fortnite?
No.
So Fortnite's really interesting. So you've got the Fortnite that we all know and play, which is Battle Royale, right? But then you've got this weird vestigial extra game on the side of it, which is the Save the World mode. And most people don't even remember Save the World mode. Like, it's we don't have any firm figures on how many people play it, but everyone's best guess is that many, many, many fewer people play Save the World than play Battle Royale. And Save the World mode had loot boxes. They were disguised. They looked like llamas, but they were loot boxes. You were paying money, and you didn't know what you were getting. And Fortnite, fairly quietly, a couple of weeks ago, just said, in order to make the experience of Save the World mode even more fun for our players, we are going to remove these. Like, they didn't say gambling or anything like that, because why would they? But they removed them. And little moves like that are very suggestive. It's now got to the point where whatever money Epic are making from those loot boxes is not worth some sort of future PR hit that they think they might take. And I think that's fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, as a gamer, it makes sense too, because as a gamer, you see a company throwing out loot boxes, you know they're trying to rip you off, and it makes you not want to invest any money into that game. Whereas if you really enjoyed it and they put up this really sexy looking skin for your character that was $20, you could just pay your $20 and get it. Almost everyone that I know will be more than willing to spend money that way, because they're seeing what they want, they're getting what they want.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think lots of gamers would agree with it, but I think it's entirely contrary to the narrative that industry lobby groups are spinning or are putting out there, which is that you love them. Like, you can't get enough of those loot boxes. They're great fun. You always get something great. That is the line the industry takes. And you know what I'd like to see? I'd like to see some research where academics like myself actually go out to gamers and say, what do you think of loot boxes? Because at the moment, nobody's actually done that. So all we have are anecdotal things like we're talking about here, where I'm saying, yeah, that sounds kind of right. And industry narratives where they say, no, it's the opposite. Gamers love them. It would be really cool to see some actual research out there that says this is what gamers think of loot boxes.
Well, hey, if you want anyone to reach out to a couple of thousand at least, you let me know. We'll put some people in front of you. We would love to do that. We would love to do that. Absolutely. Because I think all gamers really want the same thing, which is these to be gone. $30 billion, I don't know if we can ever get it gone. But I guess, let me ask this question. If there are people that are at home like myself that they hate this, you know, obviously I want to have a family somewhere in the next couple of years, and I want to share the joy of video games with my kids, but I don't want to put them on a mobile game and have to check through fine print and go, no, sorry, loot boxes, I'm out. You're not playing that game, kid. I don't care that your friends are playing it. What do you think, I guess, as a community of gamers or families with kids who don't want their kids exposed to these things, what can we actually do? Do you have any ideas of what we can do to get more exposure on this?
I know exactly what you can do. You write to your elected representative, whether that is an MP or a senator or whatever, you write to them and you say you're worried about it and you want them gone. So I think there are two routes you can go down. So you can write to the games industry and you can say, dear games industry, I don't like what you're doing, please get rid of them. Or you can write to your elected representative. All the evidence that I've come across so far from my life is that at the moment, it's very hard to talk to the games industry about this. And it's a lot easier to talk to politicians, actually. So I'd say, if you're listening to this and you're thinking that doesn't sound great, write a letter to your elected representative and say, I think you need to look into this because I think this might be linked to harm.
Yeah. And I'm actually one step ahead of you on that. So I'm going to change the wording a little bit, but I've actually done a template that I'm going to basically attach to this podcast and the video version of this that people can just download, put in their name and their local representative and send it in because I had a feeling that might have been one of your suggestions.
That's fantastic. And I imagine that I will be happy to sign that myself as well.
Yeah, because look, I don't really care who does it, who gets the word out. This is something I'm very passionate about putting to bed, as I said to you behind the scenes leading into this. But yeah, look, I guess loot box is something I'd love to see gone. Is there anything else that you wish people knew about loot boxes that we haven't covered so far today before we start to wrap up?
Let's see, that's a good one. No, I think I've covered everything. I think the one thing I'm not sure if I said this, but I think one thing that I would like people to well, probably the people who listen to this already know this. Like one thing I really want to get out there is that one of the arguments against loot boxes is that their contents don't have value, right? So like they can't be that similar to gambling because like their contents don't have that much value. But we asked about 1,000 adolescents why they buy loot boxes. And like, if you listen to the things that they're saying, I've got some quotes which I will read out to you. You listen to the things they're saying, these sound like things with value. So, once you get better at the game, everyone else at your skill level has more and more expensive skins, prompting me to buy more and more to fit in. I feel pressured to get new gear to continue to compete with ever-changing boundaries of what's classed as good gear. New gear is constantly added, gear quickly becomes outdated. You cannot be competitive in NBA 2K19 or FIFA 19 without them. That sounds like value to me. And I think one of the things that people outside the gaming community needs to acknowledge is that the value that loot boxes contain in many ways is just as worthy as actual cash. We're talking about socializing. We're talking about kids wanting to fit in. That's immensely valuable.
Oh, and as someone that's walked around the gigantic Dubai Mall here and has seen kids doing all the dances from Fortnite, like tell me they're not spending hours practicing that so they can do it with their mates at school. I mean, that's not gaming related, but I completely understand what you're saying. And on that point, I mean, this was something that I can't believe more people aren't talking about was if it wasn't last year, it was the year before, there was actually a very, very large gaming company that put a patent on an algorithm that was designed to pair people who have spent some money in a game with someone that had a very, very advanced item. He would kill everyone, including this player, right? Destroy them. And they would look on that player and say, oh, hang on a second. He's got the matchmaking is that they would put him against a lot of lower level players so that he felt like a god for a certain amount of time, really rewarding that purchasing decision, making him want to do it again. I'll actually send you the link if you haven't seen that.
No, that's amazing. And I think this is the thing that we need to think about when we think about games and what they're doing to people. Like, it's not the violence. What we're talking about here is a games company. It sounds like very cynically monetizing the need to belong, a basic human social factor, a need for relatedness. And I think that's what we got to look out for. Like I think if there's harm going on, that's where it lives.
Yeah. And that's actually a great way of putting it. I never really thought about that way. They're actually monetizing your need to belong because the gaming community, it's expanding now. Like there's a lot more mainstream I guess people playing video games compared to when I was a kid. But, a lot of us are very much the same. We're very confident, kind, intelligent people that love talking behind a video camera, but not necessarily confident, talking in front of 30 people in the real world. So that's a spectacular way of putting it.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad it was very spur of the moment. Might make it into a paper now. I think it sums up an essential truth, which is that for many of us, video games are our social worlds, and that's why they're doing the Fortnite dances, because that's where their culture's coming from. It's very real as a world, and when something becomes a social world, there's a bunch of things you could do to get money out of people. That might not necessarily be good for them. And I think that might be what we need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. But look, David, I really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend with us today. I hope that we can do justice by getting this interview out with as many people as we can, because I think more people should know about you and the work that you're doing. That meme that says "not all heroes wear capes" definitely applies to you, my friend.
Oh, that's a lovely thing to say. I'm not sure I'm worthy, but that's really lovely. I've had an amazing time talking to you as well. Please invite me back again whenever you like. I would love to continue this conversation.
No, definitely. We'll definitely have you back. So thank you very much again, and I'm sure we'll talk to you very soon.
Awesome. You're very welcome. Thank you.